Welcome. I want to welcome you to our webinar, Unlocking ADUs, a Step-by-Step Guide. We're very excited to be hosting this webinar today about the ins and outs of building an ADU in San Mateo County. I want to introduce myself. My name is Anna Alexeyeva, and I am the director of the ADU Resource Center of San Mateo County, which is hosting this webinar. The ADU Resource Center is a nonprofit that provides tools and resources to homeowners across San Mateo to make the ADU process easier and more accessible to you. And that is exactly what we're going to try to accomplish in today's session. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Today, we want to walk you through the nuts and bolts of building an ADU from conception through construction. We have a lot of ground to cover, and we're going to let you hear from experts about their specific and tactical tips and advice for how to set your ADU project up for success. A few notes of housekeeping before we get started. We do have the Q&A feature enabled today, so you can enter questions into the chat, and we'll do our best to monitor it and answer questions through the chat throughout the session. We are recording this webinar, so if you miss any information live, because we will be covering a lot of ground today, you'll be able to find a recording and the webinar slides on the YouTube channel for the ADU Resource Center, as well as our website. If you would like this session translated into another language, you can click the More button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and then the CC button at the bottom of your screen and choose what caption language you'd like to receive translation in. And finally, we are very lucky today to be joined by two ADU experts, architect Carrie Diller of Inspired ADUs and Sergio Rodriguez of Integrum Construction. Combined, Carrie and Sergio have built and designed over hundreds of ADUs in the region, and they have a wealth of expertise in this subject area. I do want to note that the ADU Resource Center is an independent nonprofit, and as such, we do not endorse any particular company or service, but we are really appreciative of Carrie and Sergio taking the time to give their expertise to you today. We are also very lucky to be joined by a homeowner who just completed his very own ADU project, and he's going to give you some tips that he wishes he had known when he was starting out the process. I want to thank Amity Armstrong, who is our Zoom manager today and will be managing all logistics. Thank you very much, Amity. Okay, I want to give you a little bit of an introduction to the ADU Resource Center before we get started. The ADU Resource Center was founded on the premise that ADUs are a great form of housing that can add gentle density to neighborhoods that are rich in jobs and are economically vibrant. The ADU Resource Center's website, smcadu.org, has a wealth of resources for homeowners about the ADU process. We have process guides, floor plan inspirations, ADU stories from neighbors who have built ADUs, and a lot more. I want to give you a bit of a flavor of some of the resources you can find on our website. Our ADU guidebook is a 70-plus page PDF guide that takes you step by step through the process. It covers a lot of the content that we're going to be covering today, but with more details and links to resources specific to San Mateo County. Next, we have our ADU calculator, which is a proprietary tool that you can also find on our website where you can enter project details and get information about the prospective costs of your ADU. This can be a great opportunity to get a sense of whether your project fits within your prospective budget. And lastly, I want to let you know about a webinar that we have coming up specifically about renting ADUs. At the webinar, we'll talk about what landlords should know, how to find a tenant, and hear tips for organizing a lease agreement. I'll give you a second if you'd like to register at the QR code provided here and at the link that Amity just dropped in the chat. Thank you very much, Amity. And at the next slide, I just want to let you know that you can stay in touch with the center through the contact page that is here in the URL or in the QR code or across social media. We, like I said, are going to be covering a lot of ground today, but this is only a starting point. If you have more questions or want to talk more, please do get in touch with the Resource Center. We are here to be a resource for you. Okay, with that, let's talk about the benefits of ADUs. Now, if you are attending this webinar today, I probably don't need to sell you on the benefits of ADUs, but I do want to give you a flavor of the range of reasons that homeowners may choose to build an ADU on their property. We know a lot of homeowners use ADUs for multi-generational living to house older parents or to house adult children. ADUs can be a great source of housing in the community, and of course, if you rent your ADU, that means you can also get rental income. ADUs increase property values. They have environmental benefits because they tend to have a smaller footprint relative to single-family homes. And we know a lot of older adults like ADUs because they allow them to age in place, moving into a footprint that might be more accessible to them while not having to leave their communities. And as you'll see in the next slide, the proof is in the data. ADUs have become hugely popular, and in San Mateo County alone, ADUs comprise almost 1 in 4 new housing units permitted in 2023. Part of the reason we've seen this steep increase in interest in ADUs is because the state of California has made it substantially and progressively easier to build ADUs across the state. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that in a minute. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's actually get into the nuts and bolts of the ADU process. The first thing I'm going to talk about is the different types of ADUs that exist. Now, Carrie's going to talk a little bit more later about how to think about the types of ADUs and what might make sense for your property, but I want to introduce you to the range of options that exist. First, you have the junior ADU or JADU. This is probably going to be your least expensive option. It's also the smallest ADU that exists. They can be up to 500 square feet, and they are conversions of existing living space or an attached garage. Now, junior ADUs don't need to have a bathroom as long as they have an interior access point to your primary dwelling, but they do need to have an exterior entrance. Next, we have conversion ADUs. Now, JADUs, which I just talked about, are a type of conversion ADUs, but there are lots of other types of conversion ADUs that exist. Conversion ADUs are a conversion of your living space or garage, attic, basement, or an accessory structure like a detached garage. Now, depending on your property, these are probably going to be less expensive than the other types of ADUs I'm going to talk about in a second. But keep in mind, if you're converting something like a detached garage, the all-in costs of that project might come in as expensive as a new build. The next type of ADU is an attached ADU. Now, attached ADUs can be attached to the primary dwelling through a wall or possibly a breezeway or a pergola, or they can be built above a garage. Solar is not required for these types of ADUs, just like they're not required for the other two types that I just talked about, and they can be less expensive than detached ADUs. Now, detached ADUs, the last type of ADU I'm going to talk about, is your classic backyard cottage. This is probably going to come in most expensive, but it's also going to give you the most flexibility on your property. The thing to know about detached ADUs is that the state law does require that solar be installed either in the primary dwelling or on the ADU itself. Now, you may be able to qualify for exemption to that depending on the size of the ADU, but installation of solar in an ADU can come in anywhere between about $10,000 to $18,000. Next slide, please. Now I want to talk a little bit about the different construction methods that exist. The first type of construction is site-built, or sometimes called stick-built construction. This is where your ADU is built from scratch on your property. It allows for the most customization, and it allows for changes throughout the construction process. Panelized construction is where parts of the ADU are built off-site in a factory, but the ADU is assembled on-site following a typical construction process. And then we have modular construction. This is where the ADU is fully built and inspected in a factory off-site and then transported to your property via crane or other method. Now, when the ADU is delivered to your property, there will be inspection for things like foundation and utility hookups. The thing to know about modular ADUs is even though they may seem to be less expensive, there are other costs that come along with modular ADUs, like transportation, foundation, and sales tax. These costs can add up to something around 20 to 40% of the overall project costs. So contrary to popular conception, modular ADUs aren't necessarily going to be less expensive than site-built construction. Now let's talk about timeline. As with everything we're going to talk about today, so much depends on the particularities of your property. But as a general rule of thumb, the time that it takes from all in, idea to finishing is typically 9 to 18 months. This is worth keeping in mind because if you're building your ADU for a particular reason, like to house an aging relative, you're going to want to be aware of the lead times to make sure your ADU is ready in time for when you need it. Next, let's talk about budgeting. Again, there are a number of factors that can affect the costs of your ADU. Everything from whether your lot is on a hillside, to the fire regulations involved, to soil conditions that may add additional expense related to testing, to utility upgrades, which can really add substantial costs to your project. However, as a general rule of thumb, in San Mateo County, you can expect for the project to cost anywhere between $450 to $600 a square foot, and that's all in costs. We can think of the different buckets of costs as soft costs, which is design, engineering, assessment, permitting, infrastructure costs, which is utility upgrades, and building costs, which is the construction itself. On the right-hand side here, we have a chart that gives you a general estimate of the price per square foot and the typical cost range for different projects. What you can see, of course, is as you go up in size, the price per square foot goes down. And that's because the typical elements that you have in a house, like kitchen or bathroom, which are generally the most expensive features, are still going to be needed in a 500 square foot ADU, just like they're needed in a 1,200 square foot ADU. Carrie is going to talk a little bit more about how to design your project with cost in mind, but there are things that you can do throughout the design and build process, like, for example, putting your kitchen and your bathroom on a single wall so the plumbing can be shared for both. Next slide. And finally, we hear a lot about questions regarding taxes. The main thing that you should know is that your main house will not be reassessed when you build an ADU. The increase in your property tax burden will generally be based on the added value of the ADU only, but it's really important for you to get individualized advice on this. And to do that, if you are a San Mateo County resident, you can reach out to the San Mateo County Assessor's Office at the URL you see here. Next slide. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about the rules, which are of course very important because they govern what can and can't get built. I could do an entire lecture about state ADU law, but I will save you from that. Also, unfortunately, we don't have time for that today. So I would just want to give you a high-level summary. The main takeaway is that state ADU law has made it substantially easier to build ADUs across the state of California. A few factors a few elements of state law that have made it easier to build include the fact that all ADUs across the state have to be ministerially approved. Ministerial approval is a planning term that means there can be no discretionary review allowed by a local jurisdiction or an HOA, for example, as long as your ADU project meets certain objective standards. There are also a lot of protections built in at the state level for certain types of ADUs, including junior ADUs, detached ADUs that are less than 800 square feet, and conversion ADUs. These protections mean that it is very difficult for your local jurisdiction to prevent you from building these types of ADUs. Parking requirements for ADUs have been substantially reduced in recent years. And one thing I want to call your attention to at the bottom of this slide is that the state has significantly made it easier to legalize unpermitted ADUs. This is a law that actually went in effect at the top of this year. So if you are a homeowner with an unpermitted unit in your backyard and you want to learn more, get in touch with the ADU Resource Center. One other thing I want to say here is that ADU state law is changing constantly, and even jurisdictions can have trouble keeping up with all of the changes. And so there are a few useful resources that we want to make you aware of. First, the Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD, which is the state agency that regulates housing, has a really helpful ADU webpage where you can learn more about ADU law, and you can write into a portal if you have questions or concerns. Also, if you want to learn about your local jurisdiction's ADU rules and standards and you live within San Mateo County, you can visit the San Mateo County ADU resource website at smcadu.org and click on the local rules. Next slide, please. Finally, I want to talk about the factors that can affect your project. And these are factors that can affect the cost, the complexity, and the timeline of your ADU project. You've heard me say a lot that a lot depends on your site, and I've just been generally providing general rules of thumb. But here are some of the factors that you'll want to be aware of or consider early on. First, whether you're on a hillside or a flat lot, whether you live in a certain zone like a geohazard zone, a fire hazard zone, or a flood zone that can add complexity and additional permitting to your project, whether you have adequate water and sewer availability, or if you're on septic. We know that projects that are on septic, for example, can get extremely expensive. When you start building or asking for a permit, you might also discover that there are certain factors on your property that you don't know about. There might be creek setbacks, for example, or an easement that you didn't know about. So the important thing to keep in mind here is that you can talk to your city's planning staff early to get a sense of whether any of these factors might play a role in your project. And if you're working with an architecture and design team, you'll be able to talk to them early on about how any of these may affect your particular situation. And with that, it's a great opportunity to segue to Carrie Diller, who's going to talk about the design process for ADUs. I am going to introduce Carrie now and let her take it away. Carrie is an architect licensed since 2003 and has been involved in ADUs since 2008. Passionate about designing for aging in place, she's dedicated to making great design more accessible. Through her firm, Inspired ADUs, Carrie continues to explore innovative ways to bring well-designed spaces and to more people. With that, Carrie, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, and I will pass the mic over to you.
Wonderful, Anna. Thanks so much for having me tonight. So we're going to go through a lot of information in a small period of time. So you'll have these slides after the presentation, but I just wanted to go ahead and dive in. So as you're picking out your architect or design team, you want to choose a team that's really going to help you realize your ADU. So what are they going to do? They're going to help you understand the property's potential. They'll clarify and help you prioritize your goals. They'll research and apply different requirements and regulations to your project and help you figure out the best way to build. And then finally, they get into designing your ADU. What to look for in your team is experience with ADUs. Now, professionals who aren't experienced with ADUs can still design them, but there are a lot of nuances, and I think Sergio will talk about some of them with ADUs later. So people with experience in the ADU industry will just help your project go smoother. You really want to look at their designs so there we go, perfect. And look at their designs and figure out what inspires you. Make sure that they can communicate clearly in the way you like to be talked to. And then if there are any specialties, like a passion of ours is aging in place, that you make sure they have. That could be sustainability or aging in place or any of those other features. So next slide, please. Anna talked about the basic ideas around different types of ADUs, but you want to understand how they may impact your budget. For example, if you're going to try to do an attached ADU or an attic basement ADU, often doing something attached to the main house will mean that you have to upgrade the main house structurally. That can increase more scope of work than you originally imagined and could have additional cost. The detached ADU is the simplest in terms of not affecting the main house, but it will affect your utilities and site. Then there are also a lot of new additions like duplex ADUs, which can be done using some new laws and maximizing the potential of your property. So people often ask how big my ADU should be, and there is definitely a sweet spot or a bread and butter zone. Most ADUs are 1 to 2 bedrooms and 1 to 2 bathrooms, and they typically fall in the 500 to 900 square foot range. That's where you start to see making the most out of your money and offsetting those expensive costs of smaller ADUs. When you're approaching the exterior of the ADU, there's different strategies. Most cities don't have architectural regulations because of the state laws. Some have some compatibility requirements, but they have to have very specific rules set up about that. So you can choose to go to the center example where you have an exact match or a near perfect match where you're using things like dormers, roof elements, similar window and door styles, and matching colors. But you can also look at different ways to approach the property, either with style contrasts or using similar materials, but in a different color scheme. Once you get the overall design and form, you still have a lot more decisions to make. So having a team that you choose that can support you in interior design, there's a lot of choices that go down from the counters, flooring, countertops, backsplash, lighting. This can get pretty overwhelming, and other people don't have, not everyone, I should say, has the ability to visualize. So while this palette might look appealing to you, When you understand what it looks like in this space, you might even feel like maybe this is not the way you want to go, or it's exactly what you want to do. And helping visualize these elements and will help you hone in on what you want to do with your ADU. Then you want to really dial in your property. One thing we think is super important is designing for privacy. So you want to understand the best way to approach your lot. For example, this gray house, which is our property we're looking at, uses the left side to access the backyard. And then in this example has a set of trees they want to keep. You also want to think about your neighbors and how you want to either obstruct or block their building or feature it as a view. So in this example, you can imagine the ADU in this back corner. They can access it from the right side of the property. You can either turn the ADU away from the main house. So this one in the example is facing away. You can see that red line. We can clearly delineate the front house from the back house. And this gives you a lot of privacy. Next slide. So that you can really have two separate yards, be out at any time. The big thing to consider with ADUs is that what you're going to design them for today most likely won't be what they're used for in 5 or 10 or 15 years. So you want to consider how it might be for a family member now, but what if it was a renter? In this other scenario, the ADU is turned toward the house. They can share access points. They can share the yard. This helps the yard feel bigger, and it makes everybody kind of use the connected resources of the site, but it can also run the risk of people feeling like they're in a fishbowl. You want to make sure that you have these shared amenities, but the big house and the little house aren't totally staring at each other, having no one use the yard because they feel like they have to be more engaged and up for connecting. Window placement is a key thing for either protecting privacy, making the most of natural light, but adding windows and skylights so that you're really making smaller spaces feel much bigger. And then alternatively, when we think about window and door placement for connectedness, large opening windows and doors can help you borrow the outside space to bring it in. This can make smaller designs feel much bigger and just help the space feel much more functional. And then I encourage everybody to think about future-friendly designs. Not everybody likes to think about aging, but a lot of our houses in the Bay Area don't support aging in place. They might have steps in, steps down, narrow hallways. With new ADUs, you have the opportunity to start from a clean slate. So you can really think about making floor plans that are easy to access, low maintenance, and then include different items like curbless showers. If you have to go into a house and retrofit to make a curbless shower, it can be very expensive. But if you incorporate it from the start, it doesn't have to add a lot of extra cost. Okay, and Anna started to talk about the different methods of construction. We've just are illustrating custom ADUs versus panelized versus prefab. But I want to go through on the left side. Anytime you start with a team, they should come out and assess your site. A lot of prefab units can't fit in backyards because of narrow lots, narrow streets, large trees. So you want to start to see what's the potential of your site. Then you're going to go into design, which is architecture and engineering, then permitting, and then construction. If we look at these three timelines in a linear layout, that one, yep, perfect. You can see in custom, you're going to spend more time in architecture, and then everything is sequential. When you get into panelized ADUs and prefab, you start to get some efficiency where you're doing some building in the factory and some building on site. Your site can potentially rule out a lot of these different types. So when you think about on-site stick built, that's just our traditional way of building. They call 2x4 construction stick built. That can work everywhere. It can work on difficult hillsides. It can work on complicated sites. As you get into panelized are great because they can typically be rolled into a very narrow access point, but they're not always ideal for a complicated hillside. And then when you get into prefab, they really simplify the disruption in your yard, but they don't necessarily go a lot faster, and they have a large crane, which isn't always viable for different properties. When you get into the panelized and prefab, you're going to have a limited number of choices. There's going to be less ways to customize it, but you will get some speed and savings out of those limited decisions. Just looking at stick built, it's going to be framed in a traditional way. Great, again, for odd shaped sizes of lots and hillsides. Panelized are going to be partially built out off-site, but then your foundation's going to be put in on the site, and then they can be rolled in and finished in the backyard. And then for prefab, the entire house is going to be built off-site. The foundation and utilities will still be done, but then it will get craned in with the large set. And that is all for my segment today. You're welcome to follow us on YouTube or Instagram, or reach out if you have any questions. And Anna, we'll take it from there.
Thank you so much, Carrie. That was great. And it's so interesting to see the different elements that design brings in and the different possibilities and also constraints to think about. I have a couple of questions I want to ask you. First, let's talk about process. So there's the obvious role that the architect and designer plays in the ADU process, but there are other tertiary roles. So can you talk a little bit about the role that you as an architect play in the process and how homeowners should go about thinking about it?
Sure. You know, really your architect is going to be your project manager. And they're also, I kind of sometimes liken it to your tour guide. We talk to clients about there's time, money, and quality, but you can only pick two. And so what we try to establish at the beginning is, what are your goals? What are the things really important to you? And then the designers, architects help you stay on track with that. So if you tell someone budget is super important, and then they spend a lot of energy showing you, you know, huge, giant folding glass doors and windows, then that's not really aligned with what you're hoping to do. And then as you transition from the design process into permitting and then into construction, they often help you build your team from consultants like surveyors and geotech, but then also picking out your contractors and helping to oversee construction during the process. So you make sure you understand what you're getting.
Very important role in the process.
Yeah.
So you spoke about the use cases of ADUs. You're obviously very interested in aging in place, and you've been doing this for a long time. And you alluded to this in your presentation, but it's very interesting. I wonder if you can talk more about it. How are you seeing ADUs change over time, and how should homeowners think about that, building for the long term?
You know, like our first ADU, I think, was in 2008, a little bit before the laws got easy, so it wasn't quite as simple, but that was built for an aging parent. They lived there for 10 years. And then after they moved on, it wound up becoming kind of a boomerang home for an adult child that came back after school because the Bay Area is so expensive. I invite people, like, when you're thinking about where you're locating the ADU in the design, where windows and doors are, how people will access it, how you may want to be able to divide the lot if it's a renter. It's good to just go through this scenario and say, what if it's me in the ADU? Am I comfortable with these windows and doors? Am I comfortable with the amount of outdoor space? And then what is it? How does it feel like if it's a renter or someone I don't know at all? And then is there an easy way to add like a buffer, a fence, a privacy feature that would make the layout of the ADU work for that evolving use case?
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so I want to ask you next about timeline. We talked about the fact that ADUs can have long lead times. What do you advise homeowners to think about as they're starting in the process and thinking about the time frame to get their ADU fully built and occupied?
I mean, one thing as we're sitting here on a super rainy night is to think about where you are in the calendar cycle. Because we've saw in the charts, the design time can be between 3, 6, 9 months, depending on how deep you want to go into the design process. Then you're going to get into permitting. So let's just say typically we can say a project is a 12-month project. So you're going to have, let's say, 6 months of design and permitting and 6 months of construction. You want to think about when to start your project so that you're starting to break ground when it's not rainy season, and you want to think about those factors too. I also think it's much easier to spend time doing 3D models or visualizations or tools to help you really understand what you're getting. It's much easier to change things on paper than it is once you've started construction. And if you start construction and you don't really understand what you're getting and you need to stop and revise and submit a revision, that can really affect not only the budget, but the timeline of the project.
Haste makes waste, in other words.
Right. Yes.
Okay, last question for you. Modular construction, modular units are really popular right now. Can you talk a little bit more about modular, how a homeowner should think about whether that's right for them, and other pros and cons that we might not have touched on yet?
Sure. We have a line of modular. I think they're really wonderful. I think they can be great. They really simplify how long someone is in your backyard, so how much of your life is disrupted. They can also simplify the decision-making process in that you can't change that many components of a modular. You can't change the form, the outside. Typically, you'll have a choice of finishes on the inside, and you can often adjust the finishes outside. But it's really minimizes the decisions, and some people really like that part of it. Alternatively, there are a lot of extra costs to it, like the shipping and transportation from the factory where it's built. The craning is, while exciting, and we like to see how the neighbors all come out to watch it be craned, it is added expense. So a lot of the savings you get off when you build in a factory, the labor costs that you offset are then kind of just reproportioned to transportation and craning the project in. So you just want to make sure that if you find a modular, that it's really working for you and you're not compromised, making choices that compromise the overall end result, because it most likely won't be that much faster. Factories are seeing delays in getting materials and those kind of things. But it can just really simplify the process.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Carrie. That was really insightful and helpful, and we really appreciate your time today. Okay. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about the next phase of the process after design, which is permitting. So once you have a unit that you are ready to bring to your planning counter, there are a few things that you should know. First of all, there are a number of agencies that might be involved in the permitting process. So it may not just be a planning department, but building department, planning department, public works, engineering, and fire. Those agencies operate differently in different jurisdictions, so we advise you to talk to your planning staff in your jurisdiction early to get a sense of who's involved and what their application requirements are. If you want to get information about how to contact the planning department in your jurisdiction, again, if you live in San Mateo County, you can find that information on the smcadu.org website. The other thing you should be aware of with permitting is that there are a lot of fees that are levied as part of the permitting process. Now, fees are still going to come out to be a very small proportion of your overall project, but they do add up, and sometimes it surprises people the number of fees that exist. So the typical fees you can expect to see in ADU approvals are planning permit fees, building permit fees, development impact fees. These are fees to help pay for infrastructure build out like roads and parks, utility fees, school district fees, and fire safety fees. A few things to note there. The development impact fees are only charged for ADUs that are over 750 square feet, and school district fees are only assessed for ADUs that are over 500 square feet. The other thing that you're going to need to keep in mind as you're going through the permitting process is that you may need to bring other experts into the process. And as Carrie mentioned, if you're working with an experienced architect, they'll be able to advise you on that. For example, you might need to bring in a Title 24 consultant who can advise you on how to make sure your ADU is compliant with the state's energy efficiency code, which is Title 24. Next slide, please. Utilities are a really big topic, and unfortunately, we don't have time to go deep into this. We hope to produce some more educational content specifically around utilities in the future, but the main things to know is that utilities are really site-specific, and so they can either be not a big deal or they can add significant cost to your project, and they can require significant lead times. So some examples of utility things that can add costs are you may need to get a separate water connection. For electrical, you're probably not going to be required to get a separate meter, but you'll probably need an electrical panel upgrade. One thing to note is if you do go down the route of getting a separate electrical meter, PG&E can have extremely long lead times in the range of a year, and that can add up to around $20,000 to the cost of your project. You may need to underground power lines. You may need to upgrade sewer laterals. These are just some examples of the utility issues that you may need to deal with throughout the process. And so it's a good idea when you're starting out and starting to work with your team to ask questions and get a sense of how utilities might play a role in your project. And so on that note, we're going to segue into the actual construction and building process. And so I'm going to pass the mic over to Sergio Rodriguez, who is the founder, owner, operator of Integrum Construction. I'm going to let Sergio introduce himself, and then we'll talk about the building process, the nuts and bolts.
Thank you, Anna. My name is Sergio. As mentioned, I am the owner of Integrum Construction. You can turn to the next slide, please. My wife and I, Elaine, we have built from 2020 to now, we've built easily over 100 ADUs. I would say about 60 to 70% of the ADUs that we've built are in San Mateo County. So we're very familiar with that piece of the Bay Area there. You can turn to the next slide. We've built all kinds of ADUs, as mentioned in the other presentations, from attached to detached to garage conversions to multifamily housing conversions, where you'll have let's say a 15-unit complex and there's a janitorial room, and we've converted that to an ADU as well. And we've done it all, down to ADUs on hillsides, flat lots, with piers, all kinds of construction. We've seen it all. If you could turn to the next slide here, you could turn to the next one as well. And as you can see, we built all kinds of styles, modern, contemporary. On the bottom left picture, that was an ADU that we cut out a piece of the hill, and we built these massive 10-foot retaining walls and placed an ADU there. So we have a lot of experience in this field, as we're going to go into as we go into the questions with that Anna will ask. You can go into the next slide. You can turn to the next slide there. One of the things that we'll do when we go into your property, the first things we'll do is we'll look at your site conditions. As mentioned, as Carrie and Anna mentioned in the past, we'll go into the utilities. Utilities is a big topic in ADUs because it's the most difficult part of the project, especially dealing with PG&E, how we're going to connect to the sewer, how we're going to connect to the water. As you can see in the middle picture there, that was about a 300 linear foot trench that we had to connect the main house to the ADU. So that's one of the things that we'll go into in the questions and answers. You can turn to the next page. So if you have any information for us, any questions, you can follow us on Instagram. You can DM me. Here's our email and our website, or you can call me directly on my phone number.
Thank you, Sergio. Okay, I'm excited for this part of the conversation because this is really where the rubber hits the road, so to speak. So a few questions for you. First of all, let's talk about process. When do you advise that the contractor or GC gets involved in the process?
I would say a lot of folks contact us. They contact us first, and we always guide them to an architect. We will refer them to one of our design partners like Carrie. So I would say the first thing that when Carrie submits her first sets of plans to the city, that's when we would come in. I think that's, or another GC. We would advise that you start talking to general contractors once you have the first set of plans, the architectural plans, as you mentioned in the past presentation, that full set, Title 24, structural drawings, and the architecturals.
Gotcha. And so that's when. Now, how and where should a homeowner who's interested start looking for a builder? What are the things that they should be looking for in a GC?
So Carrie touched on a really good point, and she mentioned that her firm will actually help the homeowner pick the GC. They'll give them options, and I think that's probably the best place to choose your general contractor. Talk to your architect. They know who are the good builders and the ones that they can trust the ones that are going to work together with that firm, with the architectural firm, I would say that's your best bet. And I would, ask your architect to minimum, get 3 contacts and then start interviewing from there.
And so you're interviewing a GC or you're interviewing a couple of GCs. What should you be asking them? What should you be looking for in those conversations?
Yeah, as mentioned before in the other presentations that Carrie mentioned, not every general contractor builds ADUs. Building ADUs is a very special niche. So I would ask, how many have they built? Are they familiar with that? Out of their whole operation, how many ADUs are a part of their operations, right? Do they build more custom homes and they only do a couple ADUs a year? I think that's important because ADUs can get tricky, especially dealing with utilities. And so I would say, look for a general contractor that this is their bread and butter. This is what they specialize in.
Gotcha. So let's say a homeowner is now comparing 3 bids. They've got to that part of the process. How should they be evaluating those bids? What should they be comparing and looking out for?
I think what's sometimes in a bid, what's more important is not what's included, is what's excluded, because that's where the fallouts happen. So I would say look for an exclusions list and then compare if the exclusions list match among the bids. I think that's very important. The second thing that I would look for is make sure that the bids are extremely itemized to every trade, and there's a number next to each proposal. I would avoid a proposal that's just narrated and there's just a lump sum number, because then you can't compare apples for apples. I think that's very important.
And I know that you shared an example scope of work on the next slide, if we can look at that, and if you want to add anything there, Sergio.
Yeah, so this is an example here. We itemized every single thing, down to our dumpsters, down to our trenching for utilities, our excavation for our foundations, our rough framing, our cabinet, everything. So this is just an example. It doesn't have to look like this, but I think this will help a homeowner compare to make sure that everything is accounted for.
Gotcha. So now let's talk about the actual construction contract. What are the things that you should be, the homeowner should be looking out for in the contract? What are any red flags that they should be looking for?
So in this California State License Board, the CSLB, in their website, there is a link that talks about contracts. And the state of California, they want contractors to abide by specific language in that contract that goes down to change order procedures, to termination clauses, to timeline verbiage. And so make sure that when you get a contract, that you compare that to the California State License Board guidelines. Make sure that the contract, it shouldn't be one page. The contractor contract, the home improvement contract, should be at least 15 to 20 pages with it, very broken down.
That's great advice. And then in the next slide, I know that you shared some examples of milestones. So can we talk a little bit about the payment terms that will be built into the contract and the draw schedule? Can you talk us through what a typical draw schedule looks like, and what should we be looking out for any considerations here?
Yeah, so there's 2 kinds of payment arrangements. If you're in a cost plus, you're probably going to get a schedule of values, and then every 2 weeks or every month, the contractor will draw a percentage towards that value, and that's very common. A lot of ADU builders will do, it's a fixed bid, and it's more payment schedules based off milestones. So the way our payment schedule is set up, this is just an example here. We'll do $1,000 deposit, and then everything after that, it's all upon completion of milestones, and it works out pretty well. At the end, there's still enough value there for us to be incentivized to finish. I would avoid a contract where it has $1,000 left at the end, because a lot of general contractors, they're not motivated to finish the project. And at the end of the project, it's one of the hardest phases of the construction, because we got to get down to that last detail. So we want to have enough meat on the bone at the end so that the homeowner can push and complete their project.
Gotcha. And the last question as you're going through selection is license and insurance. What are the best practices here in terms of checking that your contractor is licensed or that they have enough insurance and aren't going to leave you, in the lurch?
Yeah, this is really important. So whenever you're getting proposals, make sure that you look up each contractor. Each contractor should have their license number on the contract or on their proposal. Go on the state license board and just type their contractor's number on there. If there is a disciplinary action, if they've been doing unfair practices or whatever legal disputes, the state will post it on their page and it'll tell you why. Another thing it'll tell you if their insurance is active and it'll tell you if they have workers' comp. If your general contractor doesn't have workers' comp, that's a red flag. So I would make sure that each contractor that their license is clean, that they have insurance, and the workers' comp is active as well. And all that is easily visible on the state license board website.
Okay, so I have one last question for you, and it's more around the actual building process. So we talked about timelines already today. From the construction point of view, what are the typical lead times or construction times that we should be thinking about? Anything else in terms of current construction times that you'd want to raise for homeowners?
Yeah, so right now for construction timeline in general, we average around 3 months. 3 months is kind of best case scenario. A lot of times they can last up to 7 months. So I would expect something more realistic is anywhere between 3 and 7 months is kind of a good range of where you'll probably end up completing your ADU. Now, when it comes to materials, windows could be a really difficult line item to get. So the way we do it is as soon as we get a contract signed, even if the project that the plans are not approved, we'll go ahead and order those ahead of time so that way we have them ready. But typically those are about 10 to 12 week lead times for windows and cabinets as well.
That is very good to know. Okay, Sergio, thank you so much. This has been really helpful. These really tactical tips are so helpful for people who are starting out on the process. So we really appreciate you taking the time today to share your expertise. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, and now last but not least, we are very, very lucky to be joined by a homeowner, Ned. Ned is a homeowner in Menlo Park and has lived there for a total of 19 years, and he just completed his ADU in December. It is a 499 square foot, 1 bed, 1 bath with a loft. The design of the ADU was intentionally crafted to mirror the design of his main residence, which is a New England style shingle house. And I am just going to go through a few questions, Ned. It's so interesting to hear the first person perspective of someone who just finished this process. So thanks so much for joining us today. Can you start by telling us a little bit about the project and what motivated you to build an ADU?
Well, originally I was thinking to house my mother, who was back in Boston and was getting quite old, and I wanted her close by, but she's a very independent lady, and I knew I would only get her out here if I could give her her own place to live.
Fair enough. We know that that's a reason that a lot of folks build ADUs, so that makes a lot of sense. And how long did the process take from start to finish for you?
Well, I would say the design and permitting phase, we weren't in a big hurry, but we took about a year to do that. And then the build was just about 6 months.
Okay. So I want to ask you about selecting your team of vendors. I've asked this of different folks in the conversation. I'd love to hear your perspective as a homeowner. Now that you've been through the process, what do you think is really important when you're selecting the team that you're going to work with?
Well, I think that you have to find folks who are going to be good at and trustworthy in the education process, because you're going to learn a lot over the course of putting this thing together. And there's a lot that they have to pass along to you so you can make good decisions. It's also good, as I think both Sergio and Carrie noted, if the architect and the builder know each other and have worked together before, that's a very good sign. And I think it's important that they built in your town or your city, because every city is different, and having some relationships or prior experience there is a big help when it comes to understanding the requirements and the just the general personality, you might say, of the local officials.
Absolutely. Okay, so now this is the meat of the conversation. This is what we're all waiting to hear from you. I'd love to hear what surprises, what unexpected things did you learn in the process that you wish you could have told yourself when you were starting out?
Ah, yes. Well, I think you have to accept the fact that putting a new house in your backyard, which wasn't really intended for that, is a kind of hack. It's going to bring surprises with it. And for me, for instance, the town of Menlo Park, city of Menlo Park, decided that I had to have a geoengineering study, which resulted in a very demanding spec for the foundation, including a 48-inch footers in the foundation, which really increased the cost of the project. Not all towns require that, but it's good to know that up front. I was surprised when the local sanitation company showed up with a $6,000 fee to hook us up to the sewer system. That seemed to come out of the blue, and they didn't really have any published way of explaining why it was so much money, nor did they have to do any work for it. So it was just a fee. I realized that I should have probably paid a little more attention to some of the detail going into the project. So I love kitchens, and there was a nice line item for a nice set of cabinets. But when I actually came to meet with the cabinet maker, I realized I wanted some upgrades. And so those cost a few bucks. I didn't have to do them, but I probably should have thought about that in advance. Power, we both Carrie and Sergio mentioned power. So I had a 100-amp service to my house, which is older. And of course, ADUs can only be, under California law, have electrical appliances. So you can't go put your gas to work at all. And that basically meant that I'd either have to power this ADU off of the 100-amp service, which wasn't really viable. I mean, first time my daughter stayed there and she turned on her hair dryer, she knocked the power out. So if you've got an induction stovetop and an electric oven and everything else in the unit is electric, you really need a service upgrade. And as was noted, PG&E is very slow and pretty expensive to work with. And then you'll have to pay a private electrician to put in a new panel, potentially a new meter, and do a lot of other work so that you can get adequate service to run your own house and the all-electric ADU. So that was an expensive component of the project for sure.
I know one of the other things that you mentioned and that we've talked about is the sewer line. That was something that we've already referenced in the conversation. Right. Think about how your ADU will connect to the sewer, not something that necessarily people are thinking about when they're first envisioning their unit.
I found that, yeah, I was I think Sergio would attest that I was very worried about that from the get-go. I was always wondering where the sewer line was going to go and how it would reach its destination. And they got it done and it's fine, but it can be tricky because it has to have a slope to it, of course, and there's going to be a big trench and it's probably going to cover quite a distance. These sewer company, the sanitation company, wants to make sure that it actually works. So there's a fair amount of inspection that goes on to ensure that that's the case. I was maybe needlessly nervous because Sergio delivered, but it did seem like a tricky problem.
The other thing you'd mentioned to me that I found really interesting is small appliances and thinking about what costs more. And this goes into the somewhat counterintuitive nature of ADUs, where you always think smaller is cheaper, but it doesn't always work out that way. So what did you learn about appliances? Right.
Well, I mean, the small kitchen with very cute miniature appliances is a real treat. It's very nice, built-in refrigerator, things like that. But they are more expensive, and especially if they're built-ins. And there are fewer models to choose from. So you have to take that into account. You will pay for small appliances prices that you'd normally associate with premium built-in appliances in a regular kitchen.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Those are really interesting tidbits of the war-weary experience at the end of the process. But I'd love for you to share any final thoughts. I mean, you shared some of these issues that came up and unexpected challenges, but in the end, how did you feel about your project overall?
I was quite happy. I don't build physical things for a living, but I build other things, and I recognized going in that there were going to be surprises, and it would probably cost me more than I anticipated. But it wasn't out of line with my expectations, and I really, really liked the result. I really enjoyed the process of working with my designer and contractor. So it was very positive, and the final result is terrific.
Well, thank you so much, Ned. Really appreciate you sharing your insights. This is really interesting and helpful. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we are 3 minutes from the end of our time, and we have reached the end of our program. And so if you do have any final Q&As, I believe we've answered all of the questions in the chat, but I'll give a minute or two for folks if you want to ask any more questions in the Q&A. I hope that you learned something useful in today's session. We are, like I said, the ADU, or I am the director of the ADU Resource Center of San Mateo County, and we'll be putting out more educational content like this in the future. So do please stay in touch, sign up to our newsletter to learn more about resources as they come out. When we do close the Zoom webinar, one piece of logistics, if you're willing to stick around for one more minute, if you're willing to take a survey to give us feedback on what you learned and anything you'd like to learn more about, that would be great. In the meantime, Carrie, I see if there's anything you see in the Q&A that you want to answer live.
Well, Michelle just asked a great question about resources for financing. And so I wondered what the AD Resource Center has for financing, and what are you all doing in terms of education on that?
Absolutely. Yes. Unfortunately, this is one of the slides that I cut from the presentation because of lack of time, but I can give a very quick overview, and this is definitely something that we can cover in more detail in the future. So in terms of financing, this is assuming that you're not funding your ADU from liquid assets. You have a couple of options. First is the cash out refinance, which a lot of homeowners are not going to be interested in because of where mortgage rates are right now. Then the second option you're going to look into is secondary mortgages. So there are a few different types of secondary mortgages. There are HELOCs, lines of credit, and HELoans, and they have different advantages depending on your circumstances. You may want to talk to a mortgage broker to figure out what's right for you. The general rule of thumb with a secondary mortgage is you need at least 20% of equity in your house in order to qualify, in addition to having income and credit requirements that qualify for a secondary mortgage. Now, if you don't have that level of equity in your house, you're going to be looking at a construction loan, which can come with a higher interest rate. But the advantage of a construction loan is that it lets you lean on the as completed value of your ADU. One other thing that I want to note is if you're looking to buy a house and then build an ADU on the house, you want to look into a few products like the Reno Choice and the Homestyle programs, or loan products that are offered by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. The advantage of those is that they bundle the financing for the purchase of the property as well as the new construction, and that can bring a lot of advantages and simplify the financing process. Locally, we're really lucky because there are a number of local lenders that are providing really innovative and good financing products for ADUs. So definitely shop around. There are some products that incorporate the potential future rental income if you're looking to rent your ADU, and that can be a really big advantage. And the last thing I'll say on financing is this is an ecosystem that continues to change. And so now is a good time to be looking into financing because more and more options are available every single year. So definitely shop around, look at your options, but there are options for financing your ADU. So thank you, Carrie, for calling that out. And with that, I think we're going to close off the session. Thank you again, everyone, for joining. And we really appreciate it. Hope this was a helpful session. Bye.
Thank you, Anna.